When I was 9 years old, my family and I discovered a small white cat wandering around our neighborhood in South Florida. Snowball, as she came to be called by us. Yes, this is a cliché name, but it is appropriate to the limited capacities of a 9-year-old, so don't mock too much. Snowball quickly became one of my favorite creatures in the world. Yet one evening, as I was drifting towards sleep, I had the sort of insight that means you're either a theologian, a serial killer, or an existentialist. Snowball was going to die. Probably not tomorrow, probably not the next day, but eventually I would wake up and have to reside in a world in which Snowball existed only in memory. Quickly I woke my grandmother, who was sleeping soundly. After all, such a realization necessitated a very, very dramatic action. I woke her up to inform her of my concern. I told her we could not keep Snowball, because if we did, I'd end up loving her, and then she'd die, and I'd feel sad. My grandmother, offering the sort of wisdom that typifies being a grandparent, told me that if I cut off my still burgeoning relationship with Snowball, because I was afraid of the pain that might come with death, then I'd miss the joys too. Being human, in what follows are my words, not hers, means opening oneself up to another creature, and thus making oneself vulnerable to pain, to suffering, to disappointment. And that really the most authentic human life, if we're really attentive to it, is not one closed in upon itself, afraid to love because of the limitations of life, but ready to love unto the end. For that's the great adventure in the first place. You see, that's the authentic human life. That's the life that we want to live. Human love in such a life, then, is a kind of sacrifice, a giving of oneself that could be received or rejected. The vulnerability of a world in which each of us enters into relationship with other human beings and creatures who, sadly for us, may reject our love. And even more sadly for us, if they accept it, we still know that one day they too will die. Dear friends, this level of vulnerability, of total human love, is the mystery signified by the scriptures of Good Friday. It's easy for us who have become attached to a fear of vulnerability, of a kind of not having the taste for what complete self-gift involves, to confuse this. We may perceive Christ's gift of himself upon the cross as an act of divine retribution, an angry father who drips every last drop of blood from his son as payment for the sins of humankind. But this would not be an authentic act of love. It'd be the way that one would love if you were afraid of vulnerability, of true servanthood. We could hear such a paltry God saying, "This will get your attention. I didn't spare even my son. What do you think I'm going to do to you? Now you'll finally love me, right?" This is the inhuman love of a tyrant, not the humane love of a triune God. The readings of this feast, and yes, Good Friday is a feast, draw us away from such an interpretation. The mystery of Good Friday is the priesthood of the suffering servant. The prophet Isaiah, describing this servant, writes, "He was oppressed, and he was afflicted, yet he did not open his mouth. Like a lamb that is led to the slaughter, and like a sheep that before its shearers is silent, so he did not open his mouth. By a perversion of justice he was taken away." Who could have imagined this future? For he was cut off from the land of the living, stricken for the transgression of my people. They made his grave with the wicked, and his tomb with the rich, although he had done no violence, and there was no deceit in his mouth. Christ was oppressed on the cross. Christ was afflicted on the cross. Injustice did him in, a love so deep, so true, that it went down in search of tax collectors, of those on the margin, of those of ill repute, that sort of love led him to be taken away. But he did open his mouth. He answered Pilate, "You say that I am king, for this I was born, and for this I came into the world, to testify to the truth. Everyone who belongs to the truth listens to my voice." On the cross he says to the good thief, "Truly I tell you, today you will be with me in paradise." On the cross he tells his guards, "I am thirsty." On the cross he reveals, "It is finished." On the cross he cries out, my God, why have you forsaken me?" You see, Christ is like a lamb that is led to the slaughter, but only like a lamb. Christ was led to the cross, became our high priest, because he loved to the end. Lambs do not love unto the end. They go where they are led. But Christ is a lamb like us. For we do not have a high priest who is unable to sympathize with our weaknesses, but we have one who in every respect has been tested as we are, yet without sin. Christ, our Lamb, knew the cost of love. He knew that total love, total vulnerability, total self-gift, even to the point of death, death on a cross, would be costly. It always is in a world that rejects truth, that rejects love. In a world in which those in power desperately try to remain so, try to remain invulnerable no matter the costs. In a world in which justice is not necessary, but is always a gift, an act of obedient love to the Father. But Christ did not close himself in, but rather continued to open his mouth, offering words of love. Christ's superabundant gift of love, made all the more loving by his identity, fully God and fully human, upsets the logic of a non-sacrificial love, of frantic attempts to remain invulnerable. In other words, Christ's gift on the cross purges sin. It is the priestly sacrifice of the suffering servant, who loves unto the end. So we too are called to love unto the end. Our God knows how hard this is in a fallen world. You see, that's why it's so important to have a high priest who knows our weaknesses, the temptations to be less than vulnerable, to sin. Yet the cross is also a sign of possibility. For Christ rose from the dead. Love, when it even seems to have failed, wins. Every act of love is an offering to the Father, an offering made possible by his Son, an offering inspired by the Spirit. So on Good Friday, let us gaze upon the sign of the suffering servant. Let us adore the cross of Christ. Let our hearts be moved to see the truth of this mystery. Beloved, let us love one another, because love is from God. Everyone who loves is born of God and knows God. Whoever does not love does not know God, for God is love. God's love was revealed among us in this way. God sent his only Son into the world so that we might live through him. In this is love, not that we loved God, but that he first loved us, and sent his Son to be the atoning sacrifice for our sins. Beloved, since God first loved us so much, we also ought to love one another. No one has ever seen God. If we love one another, God lives in us, and his love is perfected in us. Before such love, how else may we respond but joining our voices with the choirs of angels? Holy God, Holy Mighty One, Holy Immortal One, have mercy on us.